Good day. In a very beautiful atmosphere, the Hof van Axen, a place in Drenthe, in Holland, we're talking with Richard Duree. He is involved with something he calls neuroenergetic psychology. It's a way of dealing with people, a therapeutic way, and something that is related to Touch for Health. Welcome, Richard. Tell me, what is Touch for Health and how did you come across it?
Originally I was working with a man who did healing after a motorcycle accident in Grants Pass, Oregon. And I worked with him for about a year with his method, and then he told me that I should go to Pasadena, California and meet a man named John Thie who is doing something that I would be interested in. And so I went to Pasadena and found a doctor named John Thie, a chiropractor in Pasadena, and went in and introduced myself, and he was working with a method of balancing the muscles of the body in order to hold the structure in alignment. And he had been doing a process called applied kinesiology, which was developed by a doctor named George Goodhart in Detroit, Michigan. And after some time with his wife Carrie, and after discussions with Virginia Satir and some other people, he decided to make this method available to the public so that the public could have some influence over their own health care.
Yeah. Now, many people have an idea what Touch for Health is. I mean, I remember, you stick your arm up and you answer basically yes or no to questions about your body. And I understand it is getting in touch with your intuitive side, with the memory of your muscles. But can you explain what it is?
Well, originally Touch for Health was a method of balancing people's musculature to allow fluid flows in the body to flow more easily, and it also involved working with the acupuncture meridian system to balance those flows within the system. It branched off into other types of adjunctive therapies that use yes and no answers and have a more psychological content, such as the type of work that we do.
Yeah, because going from the pure body, the symptoms that we have, it feels as if you are more looking into the emotional causes and origins of our problems.
That's correct. Our beliefs affect our biology. So what I think, what I feel, what my emotional content on any situation is going to have effects on my physiology. And those effects can be mitigated by altering the way that people make connections in their neurology in relationship to how their body responds to sensory input.
Well, as a person who thinks and we believe that our brain is the master of our universe and of our body, what you're actually saying is that that's not totally true, that these processes in the body, the neurological processes, have not so much to do with the brain. They act by themselves and they influence our well-being and our health to a high degree.
Absolutely. When I have sensory input, when I receive messages from the environment, I have certain responses that I have that have been either programmed in biologically through our genetics or through my experiences in life that cause me to have sensations, and those sensations are immediately communicated to the body before I'm aware of it, and the body starts to respond by changing the way it releases informational substances, neurotransmitters, modulators, inhibitors, peptides, and this communication system feeds back, washes over all the cells in the body, which include the brain.
Okay, this make me remember Gurdjieff, who kind of said the body system works within milliseconds, then your emotions work within seconds, and finally your brain comes along after many seconds and says, oh, I feel good or bad or heated up or whatever.
Exactly, we put content on it later.
So the most fast system and the most primary system is the body.
That's correct. When we study, due to influences from how schools were formed originally by the church and those types of things, we had a separation of mind and body inherent in the educational system because, we could study the body in a Cartesian kind of mode like a clock, but the domain of the soul and consciousness belonged to the church. So there was a separation between the two even the way we studied it. I mean, even when you're at a university, you study anatomy and physiology in one part of the campus and psychology in another part of the campus. And so we get the illusion that they're somehow not connected. And, you know, we're a biological organism. It's all one thing that's operating, and mind is basically everywhere in the body.
Yeah, but of course this goes back very much, say, to the Gnostic or the Cathar belief system that our body and our senses, especially our lust and our those things, are from the devil, and our soul is from God, and the two are eternally fighting in this world that has been created by the demiurge. But that's a very old philosophical division between the body and that which we could call the divine. What you're saying is that we should reconnect the two, that they were actually not on the right track.
Well, that's correct. In other words, if I'm having responses from perception that are causing me to go places in my psychology that don't serve me into negative areas or responses, then I can change the way that happens. And I can do that by working on the body and relaxing the body's response to the incoming sensory input while I'm processing whatever it is that I'm perceiving.
Okay, but what is then the difference between, say, the neuroenergetic psychology and Zen meditation? Because Zen meditation is basically saying you sit down, you switch off the mind or make it blank, or stop the associations that you normally make, the trains of thought, try to stop that, you become into the body, and what they say you will find enlightenment, satori. So what's the difference between your system and, say, Zen?
Well, okay, Zen, you have to have a lot of practice, first of all, and I think what they're attempting to do is exactly the same. What I want to do is take you out of reflexive behavior from the cerebellum, where I've wired in these reflexive responses, and bring you up into the frontal lobe, where you're going to make new associations and new connections. And by doing that, you can make permanent change. If I'm able to do mindfulness without a lot of feedback from the body, because once you're in the frontal lobe, that shuts the feedback from the body down. Okay, but most people are in a world where they either don't have the time, they're running too fast in their present situation, they have a high sympathetic response to their reality, and it's difficult for them to sit still and calm the mind because they have so much feedback from the body going on. By shutting down the body feedback, that gives them more opportunity to be in present time and be conscious and move them towards that mindful state that they might get to by being able to do these other types of practices.
Yeah, but think about evolution of man. We have developed from, you know, I think the limbic system and so on, from the very primitive animal system, and then now we have the frontal lobe where all these processes happen. What you're saying is evolution that has led to our focus on the brain and consciousness. Forget about it. Go back to your primitive, instinctive ways. Isn't that a step backward instead of forward?
Well, what I'm suggesting is that when we have habitual patterns, we're using the older reflexes in the brain. And what I'm suggesting is that people can learn to use the frontal lobe in ways that benefit them in a positive manner. In other words, the more time I can spend puzzling and thinking and exploring change, the more ability I have to make change, because that lights up the frontal lobe and makes us do things differently than an unconscious type of reflexive responsive pattern.
But you say develop the connection between the frontal lobe and awareness and those deeper systems.
That's correct. In other words, to rewire those types of nerves. The nerves are different in the frontal lobe, are different than the types of nerves that are in the cerebellum. And the types of nerves that are in the cerebellum have tens of thousands of more connections per neuron. So it's very easy to get into a reflexive response pattern where input comes in. I don't have to access the frontal lobe because I already know how to deal with that.
What you mean is if you drive a car, you do it not from...
You don't think about it.
You don't think about it.
Yeah, you get in. When you first started to learn how to use the car, it was a puzzle and you had to figure it out, and that's a frontal lobe function. But once I have a certain amalgamation of repetitions of response, then the brain it's not unique anymore. So the frontal lobe doesn't pay attention to it, it puts it into the cerebellum, and then we reflexively do whatever it is. Well, people do that with their response to tones of voice, to certain patterns of words, to the way people talk to them. They have these reflexive patterns that have been habituated into long-term memory, and so when the sensory input comes in, they don't even access the frontal lobe or think about it, they just respond, and that creates a lot of the problems that people have.
Yes, because they become automatons. As
exactly.
Gurdjieff would say, we're all machines, and only if we stop and realize that we are machines, we might have a glimpse of awareness. But there's another line of thinking, like Ray Kurzweil, you're probably familiar with. People like them, they say, no, 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 we are on the verge of putting the brain, consciousness, into a computer. And one day we will transfer our mere body into a computer chip, and that will be life, and that will be consciousness. Can you follow that reasoning?
Well, my reasoning would be a little different. We're biological systems, and when we reduce it down, we're simply, frequency patterns, kind of an interactive hologram. And so our ability to light up different feelings and emotions in relationship to perception kind of sets us a little bit outside of at least what we can do now with machines and how that's going. Machines have to be programmed eventually. Probably they will learn themselves. That's possible. However, the emotional content that we have is so plastic and flexible that there's no way to escape person's feelings about an event versus the actual mechanical situation of what's going on.
Now, is this separation in ourselves between our different systems, between this body and this mind, and somewhere in between the heart and the emotions, is that not a process of exteriorization, of bringing outside, as Terence McKenna would say, of our whole culture? And I know you're from American Indian descent. In the old days, the world was one. Now the world is what lives inside you, your emotions, and then there is this outside world that we perceive, media. And more we put our culture outside. You probably have a website?
I do.
Yes. Well, I have a website. I have many websites, and all my pictures are on the website. Today we look, if someone wants to show you their pictures or their books, whatever, they show you the website. We have exteriorized it. We have come back from this original culture where everything was spoken words, transferred by ritual, transferred by storytelling, into putting it on the web. Ray Kurzweil and other people say, well, this is just the beginning and we're going to be in the computer altogether.
Well, I think, we're in a situation in the world where we have done that. We have exteriorized a lot of things. However, there's an emotional content to all perception that we have. In other words, if I'm injured, I have feelings about that. If I look at a certain color, I have feelings about that. You only need to look at things that people think are very linear, like the stock market and those kinds of things, to see how people run when they get a certain level of emotional input. Something happens in China one week and the stock market falls in New York the next day. So people are emotionally driven, and those emotions are internal experiences that are happening in relationship to things that they perceive in the external world.
So there are reactions, but the eternal quest of people is what, since I think the 1500s, we call that, with Kant and whatever, enlightenment. Yeah, we're trying to make a distinction between what is causal, what is rational, and that which is reasonable. The wrong translation of Kritiek zum reine Vernunft was that the Americans say that it's all about ratio, about the brain, about reason. It's not about reason. This man made a distinction between reasonability, which is good and bad, the metaphysics, the things that are not hard, because what is good, what is bad in one culture and another, what is of this world and what is not of this world. It feels as if society, this separation, they want to ignore the metaphysical and say everything is rational. Wow. Hence Ray Kurzweil say we can put people in the machine. But you're really saying, no, it's not true. We have to go to this other side. This emotional, what is good, what is bad, how do you feel?
Well, yes. I think that there's an issue here where, people forget what's really happening here. Okay, we're on this rock, we're flying through space. We developed here from certainly more simple origins than we're at now, and those levels of biology were built for reasons. And here we are making symbols, and we have this ability to place symbols on things and represent them, and we call that language, or we call that, whatever. But those are symbols that we created and put on things. What's really happening here is we have these apes that are walking around on this planet, and we've started to have the ability to take the past and project it out into the future, and a lot of times that causes our anxiety. Those symbols that we place on things are things that we made up. I mean, we made up our whole environment here that we're looking at, other than you, myself and you and the plants.
Well, the plants grow, but we planted the trees.
Right, we planted them here, okay, and a lot of them aren't from this environment. And so we have an incredible ability to manipulate our environment and do that, and it also creates some of our problem, because by projecting out into the future, we can project anxiety and fear and all those types of feelings out into the future.
But aren't they part of a natural learning process? Don't we have to go through all these miserable things in our life to find out who we really are?
Well, I think it's all part of a growth process. My grandfather used to say that fire tempers steel. So, you know, we go through these situations in order to reach the point where we say, okay, this doesn't work for me, and I no longer want to do it this way. Now what I have to do is take out what are my reactions that I'm having that I have no awareness or control over, and can I change those reactions so that I can spend more time in present time and be aware of my lifetime and be here each moment, rather than worrying about what's going to happen in a future that doesn't exist anyway.
Yeah, but then we're touching a very fundamental point. Like, do you believe in God or in a divine entity or direction of the universe?
Well, I believe that there's an organizing principle out here, and that it's out here doing what it does. Life is organizing, and energy systems are informational systems that are combining to create things. If you're asking me, do I believe in God, I'd have to say no, other than I am a witness to the miracle, and I'm in awe of it.
Okay, but then what gives you the right to do neuroenergetic psychology, which is a magical way of changing other people's life? You're playing God.
They change their own life. I mean, what
you play a role in that.
The role that we play in that is simply creating a safe place where they can feel safe to express themselves, to explore the types of resources that they have within them to make new connections. It's very non-authoritarian what we do.
But would you say that the people that come to you were destined or were ready for your message, which is a feedback system that you teach them?
Well, I think that people are exploring, and so when they have gone through other types of things, they just might naturally fall into what we're doing, simply because they're looking for change. They're looking for something that is going to give them the ability to have more depth and see into themselves.
Okay, now you do this with your wife Shanti, and she told me that you're more of the theoretical model, you think about things, and she does the experiential part of your work.
It's kind of a right-left brain kind of situation that we have going. Yeah.
Please explain me, if someone comes to you with a problem, whatever it might be, a physical problem, might be a neurological problem, might be an emotional problem, what is the approach?
Well, there's an interview process, and in the interview process you get them to explain to you what's going on, how does that relate to them, you know, what kind of change are they looking for, what has kept them from finding that change in the past, kind of getting an overview of how they construct their reality using the concepts. What are the concepts, the words that they use to create their structure? And by seeing what their structure is, then it helps you to, when you start applying the technique, then it helps you to get them to express themselves and explore where they're making these connections and whether that works or doesn't work for them.
Now, the technique is physical, in the sense you touch people.
We are touching their body during the process.
That's your heart, and that muscles have memories, and maybe your father touched you there, or someone hit you, things like that. So
those types of things can be involved.
It's an experiential thing.
Mm-hmm. They have an experience.
Okay. Does that involve breath?
Well, breathing is an important part of how people move energy in their body. So when you're talking, I mean, we could talk about it in physiological terms. If you're more aerobic internally, you're going to produce more adenosine triphosphate and that kind of thing. But it's really about what are the frequencies that are created by how they're moving their body and what's happening with how they're taking in nutrients and information, and oxygen happens to be one of those things. And so where they're breathing in their body affects the type of way they illuminate their memories and their energy system. And by the way, we're not talking about ionizing energy here, we're talking about informational energy.
Information, but information that's stored in our cells.
The information does get stored in the cells.
How?
Well, the different ways. One way information is stored in the cells has to do with the way peptides go up, and ligands are different types of proteins that bond to the cell structure.
Oh,
And
we're getting into biochemistry. Is that where you are?
Well,
also as a scientist?
Well, that biochemistry is part of it, but there's a lot of systems involved here. There's also informational systems that cause different types of phasing of the cell structure. So that lets different types of ionic information in or out of the cell. That causes proteins to move. Okay, proteins do the work in the body, and inside the cell, the DNA is covered by regulatory proteins, and those proteins move in relationship to perception that the cell's having on the membrane, and also through the integrins, which are...
In layman's terms, you're
Okay.
saying our emotional machine inside, in which we are, all our cells, is very complex.
Yes.
But it can be understood in chemical and in electric terms, but the result is that our brain sometimes does things what the body tells it, and sometimes it does what the world tells us.
That's correct. And sometimes there's a conflict between those two things. Sometimes there's a conflict between what is healthy for my biology.
This is not the alarm system, but the birds that are running around here and making sounds.
They're wonderful, these
This is
peacocks,
wonderful.
yeah.
Yes. But it brings me to a very strange thing. If we look at the world, because we are suffering something what we call global warming, at least the world is telling us that there's a problem, and we feel it's very hot. We're here in early May in the Netherlands, and the temperature is unusual high.
Mm-hmm.
Could you think that your system of neuroenergetic psychology could work for the world as a whole?
Well, you work on one brain at a time, okay? I mean, you work on one system at a time. And so each person's awareness, as they become more aware of themselves, it helps them become more aware of their surroundings and what's going on. If they're less focused on their anxiety and their stress, then that gives them more ability to focus on other things. I mean, obviously, you know, a lot of people are running their processor and they have bad software, if you want to use a metaphor of a computer metaphor. The processor's running at 100% all the time, but a lot of people are getting 10 to 15% output because of all these conflicting types of routines that they're running.
But is the world helping itself? In a way, you know, you worked with Timothy Leary, you knew him in the 60s, actually in the 70s, he was running around the world telling people, you know, change yourself and we will change the world. And indeed, we had the Summer of Love, and we had all these wonderful things in those days where the world became, in a way, more aware of their emotional things.
Sure.
It feels that that process had kind of shut down, or at least went underground.
Well, I think personally, I think it's still moving forward. You have much more of an awareness in people now about the foods that they eat and the types of chemicals that might be in that food. And all of that is part of this awareness process, because when you put things in the body, you're putting in specific frequencies, and those frequencies affect how the body moves information. And so I think that as people, you know, I have a friend from South Africa, and she once looked at me and she says, "How do you eat an elephant?" And I looked at her and I said, "I don't know." And she said, "One bite at a time." Okay, so we have really big problems, okay, and we're all aware of that.
And you say, start with yourself and the world.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Will change.
Where do I have the ability to make the most change? I have the most ability to change myself. And in changing myself, it changes my perspective on the world, because I illuminate different information. So if I'm spending all my time in stress
that's
and
true,
worry,
but remember Rupert Sheldrake at one time said it's the 100 monkey procedure. So there were a couple of islands, and on one island the monkey started to eat in a different way, I think using a stone to crack the nuts or something like that. And then he observed that as soon as 100 monkeys on one island got it, got the trick, then on other islands, the other monkeys, without talking to them, would have the same thing. Is this
well,
the basis?
I happen to know Rupert, and just had lunch with him last spring, and what he's talking about is a type of field that emanates from the body. And this field, and all things within a particular genus, have more receptivity due to the shape of the way their DNA...
He calls this morphogenetic fields.
Morphogenetic fields, yes. And what happens is all living organisms produce electric and magnetic fields. And some of those fields project out away from the body. And, you know, current thinking is there may be a thing called scalar waves that don't diminish with distance. Anyway, when you have a specific... How deep do you want to go in this?
No, this is very interesting, because
Okay.
I know Rupert and Ralph Abrams and all those stories. And what I'm really interested in is to see how their conception of connectedness, relates to what your grandfather and great-grandfather, the Cherokee Indians, believed about rituals and how talking to Manitou or the Great Spirit would influence the life of their tribe. They were really magical thinkers. We have come to the point where I know a lot of people like you who believe that individually we can change and can help other people change, but how does it relate to the wider society? Isn't it time to stand up together and say, let's do something about
Well,
this?
certainly it is. I mean, we're in a situation where we have this situation where we're in.
Yes. Yeah, well, there's all people around here. Yes.
Okay, we have a situation where we have the limited perceptive abilities that give us the illusion that we're separate. So the type of vision that we have only sees a very narrow part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And the type of hearing that we have only connects to very limited types of input. And this is biologically destined. This decision was made millions of years ago to frame the world in a certain way. The world doesn't exist the way we see it. Okay, I mean, it looks very real, and
No, we see a very limited
we
spectrum.
see a very narrow spectrum of what's going on, and just outside of those areas are other types of frequencies and energies. I mean, you know, people can relate to certain ones of them, like cell phone transmission, or television or radio. We're using waves to transmit, and we load those carrier waves with information. And when you have a receptive tuning fork, or however you want to look at that, it'll vibrate in a resonance with those frequencies. And so we use these types of coils inside of your television tuner, and what it does is it picks up a vibration that we can carry on these waves, and that vibration goes into a harmonic with...
Yeah, and that's what's called resonance. And people would say if you sit on as a kid you have this effect, yes?
Exactly.
You know what resonance is. It kind of gets stronger.
Yes.
But one of my theories is that magic, if it's magical, if it works, it is resonance, and that's what you're saying. It's a frequency. But that means it is related to time, because frequencies are correlated to time. It is the number of events happening in a certain time frame.
That's correct.
Some of the old religions and belief systems say time doesn't exist.
Well, that's where science today is starting to look at a phenomenon that we can't really define yet, called scalar waves. And those waves are instantaneous and everywhere all
And they
at
happen.
once. And
we're connected with them.
We think they happen, and we're all connected in this soup that is being called quantum soup or 0-point field, or whatever you want to call this energy system that we're floating in. And we have receptive mechanisms in our body. Our DNA is held by very specific types of bonds that cause them to stay in a very stable distance. And that stable distance resonates with other cells. That's part of how your cells keep themselves healthy, is by having this coalescent kind of resonance that goes on. Well, people within your same geneto group, such as your family, they're resonating at a similar vibration. And when you make change, that change resonates through your cells and can affect their cells. Well, that also happens within species. Okay, so humans pretty much have the same types of structures overall. 5 fingers.
Wait a moment. What you're saying is that we are really not only bodies that, sunlight and wind and sound, but that we are receptors for this, what we could call scalar waves, or something that we don't know, another dimensional thing.
Morphogenic fields.
And that some people are more receptive to this frequency and that frequency, which could be on an individual level, like I like you or I don't like you, but also in a family or a tribe, and worldwide.
That's correct. I mean, and that's what Dr. Sheldrake's talking about. But it also can be between species. So there's communication between your pet dog and you, and Rupert has demonstrated that many times.
Yeah, it's one of his 7 experiments that would change the world.
It was one of his 7 experiments, yeah. And so, what we're saying is now we see natural phenomena. We know this is happening. And it's like, how do we describe it? So we're looking for those mechanisms, those systems in the body that are receptive to those types of frequencies.
But in a way, this is still a very rational, causal thinking. We just say that which we don't understand has not been scientifically understood. We have no theory, we have no measurements, but it's just a matter of time till we find out. So somewhere in the future we should find out what scalar waves or string theory all means, what really quantum physics and how relativity and so on. But what then? What we lose
There'll
then
be-
is this other dimension, which is the divine that we cannot understand.
Well, I think that, I think people have a misconception about science, and they think that we're all just kind of these robots that are looking to reduce everything down to nothing, and that's really not what it is. I think that we're people who are really curious, and we want to know how nature works, and it doesn't take the magic away from me to say that oh, gee, isn't it incredible that we have this ability that works through this particular system to influence each other and be connected and those types of things that we think of as a spiritual experience? For me, it doesn't have to separate it because I want to know how it works. It enhances the magic for me. I'm so curious. I really want to know, and I see it work out in the world, and how does that function, and how does it work, and what does that mean? But it doesn't mean that it isn't magical, and I don't have this feeling of awe and inspiration and a religious experience through the understanding. And I think people get confused and think that scientists are just like these people who want to like destroy the world or make all these chemicals or do these things. I mean, there's lots of us that want to understand the magic, that we see the magic and we perceive it, and we want to know how can we enhance that? How can you bring it to everybody so that they understand it?
Yes, well, when you say, I still have the sense of wonder.
Absolutely.
Well, that's what I share. The sense of wonder, we were talking with Richard Duree on a thing that's called neuroenergetic psychology, but we're really talking about miracles and wonders and what we are and what we could be. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.